Alright, there's a lot we could say about the ins and outs of reporting student success and accurate depictions of learning, but I think we'd be here for a very long time. So for the sake of brevity, I want to raise a discussion on reporting student success via letter grades and why this system is fundamentally opposed to successful learning. The problem, as I see it, might be best demonstrated through an example. So let's take two miscellaneous students, we'll say their names are Jimmy and Beth. And let's say both Jimmy and Beth are entering their 9th year of education, which we appear prone to call the 9th grade, and we'll say that Jimmy and Beth up to this point have been ideal, perfect students. They have always achieved perfect scores on their tests, they have always graduated with 100% or an A+ in every subject they've had, and they've shown that they were developing perfectly normal for their age. Both Jimmy and Beth have had no notable behavioral issues, no notable individual challenges, and both come from very supportive families. And as educators, we've had no reason to worry about them outside of the fact that their success is a little too perfect. Nevertheless, Jimmy and Beth are model students. They understand the curriculum, and they score high in all reportable functions of education, and when we, the teachers, assess them, they appear to be learning content without any struggles. Our assessments appear perfectly fine, our evaluations of their work and their learning appear perfectly fine, and we translate that success into an A+ and a computer-generated "good job" on the report card at the end of term. So obviously I'm setting up the scenario for failure. Let's say during the first 2 months of their 9th grade education, Jimmy starts to slip. The work he turns in is subpar, only demonstrates competency in half the known content, and barely qualifies as a pass, let alone sufficient in understanding. And we're good educators in a perfect classroom, so we speak to Jimmy and we let him know that we're worried and we're there to help him if he needs it. But Jimmy has never been the kind of guy who opens up to his teachers, so we aren't really given a look into what changed in Jimmy's life to produce these subpar results, especially with his record of success. At the end of the term, Jimmy's total grade is resting just above 50%, and that's what's going on his report card. Despite our best attempts at helping Jimmy, he simply isn't able to demonstrate an understanding of half of the course's content. Beth is maintaining her A+, and Jimmy's walking away with a C-. And because we know what half of the content Jimmy does understand, we also know the half of the content that he's struggling on. And we would presume that the next grade level that Jimmy goes towards would be able to help Jimmy in those specific struggles or challenges. But letter-based grading does not communicate areas of strength or weakness. It only communicates a very brief, past-tense look at some of the unexpressed combinations of Jimmy's behavior, study habits, content strength, and knowledge, and his ability to score marks within a class. It does not communicate anything relevant to Jimmy's learning process. And I think this is where the problem also gets quite difficult and split between perspectives. The next teacher that has both Jimmy and Beth will see that Beth is much stronger in an academic setting than Jimmy simply by virtue of their grades, and will have a very limited understanding of what struggles Jimmy has been facing, what he needs to improve, and what the teacher can do to help Jimmy learn. All that will be easily accessible to this new teacher will be a history of Jimmy's performance communicated solely through letter grades and sparse computer-generated comments, and if this new teacher is lucky, a couple of conversations with Jimmy's previous teacher. Nothing concrete about Jimmy's experience of learning is carried with him onto the next grade, and nothing meaningful is brought to Jimmy or his parents in expressing his 9th year. All Jimmy and his parents will see is a C- where there usually has been an A+. What do you think Jimmy's motivations for achievement are going to be? Is he going to see that C- and realize that he's struggling and needs help because he genuinely wants to learn? Or is he going to see that C- as an indication of his failure and decide he's not that good at school, or that school is stupid and not an accurate representation of who he is as a person? The problem to me is that letter grading is a fast and lazy way to communicate a student's progress, but it doesn't actually communicate that process effectively at all. It communicates a belief about a student's aptitude fast, but not efficiently. We all assume that a student receiving A+ is strong in a particular content area, and that a student receiving a C is arguably weaker. Grades don't communicate the finer, meaningful details that are part and parcel to learning. They don't communicate that Jimmy's 9th year teacher may have been engaging in a project-based learning environment, and Jimmy has self-monitoring struggles. They don't communicate that Jimmy's reached a point in his life where he needs more experiential learning than audio-visual. Grades do not communicate the valuable aspects of data, which students, teachers, and a community of employers will need to know where Jimmy's areas of strength actually are. Letter grading even risks confusing Beth's academic strengths for actual achievement, because we don't know if Beth is strictly strong in specific learning styles and inflexible in others. For all we know, looking at Beth's academic history, she could have had an incredible ability to recall factual information, but then she struggles and draws a blank when it comes to thinking laterally about the relationship between the content she's memorized and how it fits into the world. I am taking certain liberties in this example, which of course do need to be addressed. This is a thought experiment, and it's unlikely to see any student achieve such a consistent record as Jimmy and Beth, and of course individual teachers will act dramatically different than their counterparts and will teach content in a wide and diverse method from classroom to classroom. However, my points about letter-based grading doesn't change in application. They still communicate very little about the learning process and leave neither the student or the educator with a clear understanding of what each student is capable of doing. Yet, when it comes to secondary and post-secondary education, we still treat grades like they do communicate a student's aptitude, and devalue the learning and growth that the student has experienced. Education becomes focused around an arbitrary letter, pinned to self-esteem, self-efficacy, and meant to report on a student's demonstrable skills, when in actuality it can't even remotely accomplish such a task without a comprehensive and detailed list of feedback to defend and support it. Like I said before, there are a lot of elements in this discussion which deserve to be expressed, which have no place in a short video, so I do apologize for moving on to a more pressing topic, which is a proposed solution to this dilemma. The first thing that we need to do is stop approaching grades as a pass-fail cut point. Right now, if a student achieves 50% in a course, like our hypothetical Jimmy did, that student is passed to the next grade level. We are not approaching the subject from the right perspective, which is to ask whether knowledge of 50% of the material is actually enough to consider an individual proficient in understanding that specific content. And we wouldn't consider a new driver proficient if they only scored 50% on their driving exam, nor would we consider a medical practitioner proficient to practice medicine. Our focus must be on proficiency, not arbitrary cutoff points. Once our focus is on student proficiency, some very cool things happen. Behavioral data, such as class participation and attendance, can no longer fit into a student's grade as neither represent proficiency in concept understanding. Proficiency also frees the student to represent their learning in a way that they can later apply, meaning that not all content needs to manifest in the same uniform way. This creates a movement towards practicing and adhering to educational standards instead of retention of content. What we know is that learning happens when quality, in-depth feedback on the learning process is communicated to the learner. When an individual doesn't understand key elements, scoring them on the answers they've gotten right or wrong does nothing to advance the student's ability to continue learning. Instead, identifying weakness and structuring feedback through lessons, comments, and reflection all help the student identify a problematic area of their understanding and guide them towards becoming proficient. And once we make this move towards proficiency in education, letter grades and percentiles no longer make sense to enforce, as neither form of reporting communicates that process of learning. Finally, a way of reporting on proficiency using detailed feedback can be met through a semester-long portfolio of the student's work and single-point rubrics. Single-point rubrics are designed to expect students to meet a specific proficiency in all assignments and provides a space where distinct and helpful feedback is offered by the teacher. There is no grade for students to skim to and dismiss the assignment in the past. What is created instead is an ongoing conversation between the educator and the student which emphasizes the learning process. By the end of the semester, the actual examples of each student's proficiency are collected and consolidated into a single portfolio. Each student's entire learning process, complete with detailed feedback from single-point rubrics, are made visible to that student, to their parents, and to future educators, and there is no confusion as to what the student has demonstrated proficiency in. Everything is laid bare, and the student can carry on with their learning far beyond an institutionalized education system. With alternatives to letter-based grading, there doesn't appear to me much reason why we still conform to this system. If we know that students like Jimmy will benefit from descriptive feedback and not from grades, then it seems irrational to maintain a system which obscures and distracts both students and teachers from mutually focusing on the learning process. We should be aiming to teach students the proficiencies that they need to know for the sake of knowing those proficiencies and not to meet the expectations held by an outdated system of reporting.